Okay, well, welcome back to ONLIT's Strive for Five Conversations book study. This is session 3. And as we get started, we are going to begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that ONLIT's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. Tonight's giveaway is again this issue of Perspectives on Language and Literacy from the IDA. This is an amazing 75th anniversary issue. And if you've had a chance to look through it online, it's wonderful. There is a particular article by Louise Spear-Swirling on the how of structured literacy, which is very informative. So stay tuned to the end of the session when we will draw a winner. Similar to the other 2 sessions that we've had so far, our agenda will follow this format. We'll begin by reviewing last week's session, and then we will take a look at the key takeaways of chapters 6, 7, and 8, and then we will continue to look at a Strive for Five model in action in an Ontario classroom, which just happens to be my classroom. And then finally, we'll have you in a breakout session to work through a task, and this week we'll be doing a questioning task. So to begin with, let's look at what we did last time. We looked through chapters 4 and 5 and reviewed the importance of selecting a good read aloud and how that read aloud paired with the Strive for Five model, and that you could use those together to provide opportunities to engage in conversations about text types and text features, both of which are part of the Ontario curriculum. The book provided titles such as genre, text structures, and text features to help support our conversations about genre. While reading aloud to kids, you can use the framework to engage in questions about text structures, text features, and genre. You might have your students identify which genre you are reading at that moment. You perhaps could draw their attention to how the text features are being used. And you may also ask questions about how features such as bolding or font size helps us understand the text. So I've brought tonight an example. You might all be familiar with these elephant and piggy books. This one is very well loved in my household as it is falling apart, but this is a great example of how you might just use your read aloud to highlight the text. So if you've read any of these books by Mo Willems, you will be able to see that he very clearly uses text features such as italics. He plays around with the size and the font to help direct readers to the expression that these simple characters are saying. It is a rare, if you teach grade 1 or any of those early primary or even into the older grades, these are a great text to use to help teach these text features in that fiction format, because they can be used as reader's theater, which is really, really fun, and they can act out the different pieces. We also talked about how selecting a quality book could engage a wide variety of learners in your classroom. You want the book that you're reading, again, to have something that is value added. We want to look for books with meaningful vocabulary to help extend their conversation. We should select texts that require some advanced or abstract thinking, such as inferring and problem solving, or reasoning about the cause and effect relationships. We want to be sure to select stories that will require students to grapple with the characters' complex emotions or problems that they're trying to solve. We want to select informational texts that present facts and ideas that will spark the curiosity about that text for the reader. You might also select text that is linked to a unit of study in science or social studies, or might be linked to a social emotional topic that's important for young readers to discuss. Read-alouds are an excellent space to have these conversations about vocabulary related to thoughts and feelings and moral decisions that characters have to make. They're also a great tool for providing opportunities to see themselves represented in texts and to learn about other diverse perspectives. Lastly, we discussed the importance of explicit vocabulary instruction and how it can happen both incidentally, but also through explicit instruction. I said last week that there is no way that we can teach all of the words, so we discussed how it's important to consider which words we want to teach. We talked about how in the book they refer to these categories of words as basic, advanced, and content specific, but that you may have also heard of them as tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary. The book shows that the basic words are those common words that really don't usually require direct instruction because they learn them through the exposure. They explain that the advanced words are those more domain general words, but they might have precise or complex meanings. And then lastly, we've got those advanced words the content specific words that are really linked to precise or technical meaning. And those are linked to science, math, engineering, etc. We want to make sure that we are including in our instruction that advanced and content specific words. And when we're reading those informational texts, you might be more likely to teach those content specific words and then advanced words, but that when reading the narrative, it's fine to teach mostly advanced words because it doesn't necessarily have a lot of those content specific words. And it's about striking the balance between the two. We also talked about the work of Christopher Such and that he's got a great list of words. It's on the ONlit website. We can put that link in the chat again for you. This idea of tier 2 vocabulary is really important. We also talked about the Achieve the Core website, that if you are looking at a text and you're wanting support in pulling out the text, the vocabulary that is worth teaching, Achieve the Core will help you do that by walking you through that and pulling out things for you. So before we get to this week's chapters, are there any lingering questions or thoughts about the last session? Does anybody have any successes that they want to share? Feel free to turn on your mic or just pop those ideas in the chat. Anything pertaining to explicit vocabulary instruction? If we had any luck teaching new words, the word of the week in my class was fleck. We were learning about flecks of dust. Just one of the words that came up while we were doing our phonics lessons. Okay, I'm going to just keep going through that. So our first takeaway comes from page 89 of the text. Abstract thinking is higher level thinking about connections, patterns, relationships, and complex problems and solutions. It relates to the verbal reasoning strand, which focuses on the children's abilities to make inferences and reason about complex language in books. So again, that's on page 89. So in order to do this, the teachers need to plan to ask questions that fall along a continuum, which moves from basic or concrete ideas to more abstract ideas that require making inferences and backing up their claims with evidence from the text. The continuum is broken into 4 levels. In level 1, it's called naming. In this level, you would name what you see or what they're doing. You could focus on a whole object or on an action. Some examples of that might be, what is this? Find the blank, find another one like this. Very specific and concrete. In level 2, we're moving on to describing. We're describing how something might look or move. We would focus on a selective part or an object or an action that's occurring in the text. We might say, what is this part called? Which one is bigger? What is this used for? In level 3, we've moved on to inferring, where we're using language to retell experiences or restructure perceptions. Here, we might focus on inferences, judgments, opinions, and past events. Examples might be, what happened when, XYZ, how does he or she feel, what can you guess, infer is happening when. And lastly, we have explaining. Here, you'd be using language to justify and think beyond what you can perceive. You might focus on what might happen in the future, why things happen, or how to solve problems. Some examples of that might be why, and then you keep going. How do you know? What if you change this? You will ask a variety of question types depending on the age and skill of your students. The text on page 90 gives some suggestions on the ratio of the type of questions that you should be asking. They're supposing the idea that teachers might ask about 6 questions per read aloud, and that students in kindergarten should get about 2 concrete questions to 4 abstract questions, whereas in grade 1, we should really be moving to fewer concrete and more abstract. In the early years, most students are independently engaging in text with simple decoding and text structures. So if we're thinking about the decodable books in our classroom, in my classroom, we have Bob books, we have Dandelion. They are very simple structures right now. there's really not a lot for them to grab onto, not a lot of meat in those books. So in order to continue to build their language skills, we must provide opportunities for engaging in complex texts also. The Strive for Five framework provides educators the opportunity to engage in those complex texts while supporting the language knowledge and development. When we're engaging in level 3 questions, it's providing space for young readers to practice those inferring skills. These skills are required in order to become proficient readers, as many authors will leave out details that are required to fully comprehend the text. The level 4 questions focus on developing the causal reasoning, which enables the reader to build the knowledge by thinking about how the various details in the text affect one another. The framework can also be used to help students show what they know. It can also be differentiated for students who may need to start with concrete questions and then move to more abstract. To do this, the educators will adjust when they introduce the abstract question. You may also change the question type depending on where you are in the text. Comprehension checks are best done with a concrete question, but if you're trying to elicit higher level reasoning, you might begin with those abstract questions. At the third turn of the conversation, you can make that decision to whether you should be pushing ahead or maybe reframe it to something a little bit more concrete or simple. When we're downward scaffolding during questioning, we can support learners who need it. We can also use those visuals and gestures to support our language learners. And we talked a little bit about that last week, about supporting our vocabulary with gestures or visuals to help them understand what those keywords might mean. We saw that example from Laura Bross, where she has it posted on her door of what the word is, the student-friendly example, as well as an image to help them learn. We're going to watch this video here. And this video is a teacher asking a guided question and using the Strive for Five framework during a read aloud to promote abstract thinking. I also like this example because it shows how we might use a text in literacy to support our understanding of a science concept. Is that better?
Let's use our background knowledge. Remember that word we learned yesterday? Background knowledge about what we know about the moon and what we read yesterday and today. Let's see. How is the moon in the story like the real moon? So how is the moon here in this story like the real moon up in the sky? Mateo, can you tell me how the moon in this story is like the real moon outside?
Safety position. Spoons in your belly.
Do what?
He needs eyes.
He needs eyes? Well, that moon in the video has eyes, but the real moon up in the sky doesn't have eyes. But it does have what? When we painted our picture, it kind of has what? No? Is it flat or is it kind of bumpy?
Bumpy. Chunky.
Bumpy. Very good.
So this comes from the end of that video, that when we're supporting abstract reasoning, we want to develop a guiding question before reading that requires the abstract thinking to occur. We then want to make sure that we come back to that question when we're done reading. So I'm actually famous for forgetting to come back to that question. So I got in the habit of actually writing the question or the prompt on the board because I, of course, will have a child in my class who says, Miss Smith, you forgot to do that. So it's a really great tip. If you are one that likes to sort of power through and keep going, writing the question down for them to see reminds them that you should come back to that question. We use the Strive for Five framework with the scaffolding to support the student to make accurate inferences, conclusions, and comparisons. And you can see in that video that the accuracy was key. She was reframing and recasting that question to get the accurate answer out of the child. Lastly, we will name the strategies that you are modeling. The text provides visuals of different thinking strategies that you might use. We want to think about front-loading those strategies to allow students to select a thinking strategy that works best for them for that specific text. This is a bit of a departure from previous thinking where we taught skills in isolation instead of that where we might do 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. I remember back to my filing cabinet where I had all of those files ready to go from one year to the next. Instead, we want to use a text forward approach where the text is dictating and the learner are determining which strategies are best used in that context. Another thing to remember is that if you ask too many questions, you might interrupt the flow of reading. This is another reason why the idea of repeated reading works so well with that interactive read aloud. We discussed this a little bit in session 1 on how you can spread the questions out throughout each reading. So if you're reading the book a few times, you're only really asking 2 or 3 questions at a time. And this allows you to save some of those abstract questions for that final reading when students do have had a lot of access to the text. In Striver 5 on page 96, there's a really great chart on the questions that could be asked through multiple readings. And there's also a link to the download for their strategy posters. It's one of those QR codes that they have. We can also move from concrete to abstract thinking through instructional units. And again, text sets can help. We learned last session that text sets are groups of texts and media resources that center on a specific topic, and that they're really designed to help all learners build that background knowledge and that vocabulary. I shared some of my texts for the grade 1 science unit, daily and seasonal changes. I could use those simple texts to start with concrete questions such as, what are the seasons in the year? And then I could move to more complex ones, such as, how do we adapt lifestyles in winter to survive? Whether you're reading a singular text or a group of texts on a singular topic, the Striver 5 book suggests this sort of brief outline on how you might schedule your repeated readings. On day 1, you might focus on building that background knowledge with that text or accessing that background knowledge. On day 2, you might explain some of the reasoning between the links of the text. And then on day 3, you might infer some of those outcomes. Writing is another amazing mechanism to support comprehension and your students' ability to communicate their understanding. Writing can be incorporated with pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading routines. It can include writing about concrete thinking as well as more abstract concepts. And the Striver 5 conversations can scaffold those writing tasks. Here is an example of something my grade 1 class was working on. This is a pure writing task. It's not related to a text we were reading, but you can see that the student was encouraged to write a sentence that was concrete. I see horses running in the water. But we've also really been working on hard at asking questions, just in general, both orally and in writing. And you can see that this child is beginning to ask questions that require them to think a little bit more deeply about the text. He asks, or the image. Here he's asking, what are the horses running to? Where are they running to? What are they running on? When the students bring their work to me to sort of get corrected and checking for the things that we're checking for on our checklist, I always prompt them to answer that question orally. Then, as an extension on the back of this page, they'll actually answer those questions. So where are the horses running to? He would write what he's thinking about based on the information we have on this image. This is another example that comes from Laura Bross, who, again, we've talked about her great Instagram, Miss Bross Learns, from her grade 2-3 class. Here she used a mentor text about octopuses and providing the students with a framework for responding to the prompt. So the prompt here on the framework is describe what octopuses can do to protect themselves. And then on the final draft here, we've got the octopuses need to protect themselves. Protect means to keep safe. Describe what octopuses can do to protect themselves. Support your answer with details from the text. I reached out to Laura and she told me that these come from a pre-assessment on Think SRSD. So if you are interested in more on this self-regulated strategy development, Think SRSD is where you might want to go to learn more about that reading and writing combination. Key takeaway number 2. Background knowledge is required to understand what we are listening to or reading. It helps us make inferences and fill in gaps in a text. Background knowledge is essential to reading and listening for understanding. You may have seen this before in other texts that you've read about comprehension, this idea that comprehension occurs at 3 levels. The surface level is being able to read the words on the page, even if we don't quite understand them. The text-based level includes understanding both the macro structure and the microstructure of the text. The macro structure is how the text is structured. The microstructure includes the individual ideas and how they connect to each other. The situation model is the overall mental model created by bringing to bear background knowledge to understanding to the text base. We use our own relevant knowledge to fill in the gaps and make inferences, leading to a deeper understanding of the text. To help students create that situation model during an interactive read aloud, it's important to first activate that background knowledge of the text. It's important to note that you can't activate knowledge that doesn't exist. So building that knowledge is also important. So we want to do both. We want to build knowledge, but also activate knowledge that is there. The way that we can do that is we can ask questions about the text you are about to read. We already talked about how you can use the framework to discuss genre and text features. And when you're presenting a new book, asking questions about what the children already know about that topic can help activate their prior knowledge. We can remind students about any prior learning that is related to the text. I'm often saying, remember when, or do you remember how I told you, to really remind them that they have actually learned this and that it's not new and this is not the first time. Because I'm doing repeated readings in my interactive read alouds, I can often refer simply to yesterday when we read the text or last week when we read this text to help them activate their knowledge. You can help the students see the connections between the ideas and the book you're reading and to help them start make connections on their own. You can also use the content during the framework during those content area instruction and activities such as investigations, observations, and informational text read alouds. This is not just something that you would use when you are sitting down to read a book. You can use it also while you are engaging in conversation while doing these activities. We can also build background knowledge by integrating the content and literacy instruction, by infusing content area teaching into literacy instruction, or infusing literacy teaching into content area instruction. When we just talk about content area, what we're talking about is the social studies, the science, the history, the geography, and the science and the intermediates, as well as any of those social emotional topics, right? Those are those content areas. By doing this, we are building background knowledge and we're strengthening their vocabulary and reading comprehension. We can plan instructional units around our science and social studies. In the Ontario context, we have our content areas already set for us in those grades 1 to 8, the predetermined curriculum, right? Things that we are meant to be following. A lot of the books that come out of the United States, they might not have a curriculum that is as laid out as ours. So that's how come you'll often see them suggest curricula. We already have that laid out for us. In the kindergarten program, however, we do have more flexibility, and we often use our students' interests as the catalyst for that content area instruction. We have 4 frames in kindergarten, and it does sort of lay out some of the things that we need to be teaching, but in terms of the actual specific topics, they are meant to be student-led. We want to make sure in both cases that the learning builds upon ourselves so that students can use that content information from previously taught areas and help them understand new information. So to give you an example of that, last year in my kindergarten class, we started by studying plants in the fall. I had grown like 12-foot, well, they were supposed to be 12-foot sunflowers, but they really only got to about 6 feet. And we brought those in and we were doing all these inquiry around these sunflowers and what happens to flowers as the seasons change. That, of course, led us to think about in wintertime, well, what else is changing now that we've changed seasons? What are the animals doing in the winter? And this, of course, could be continued into the spring with the return of the growth cycle. For us, we had a pod of praying mantises. And so we were going to release these praying mantis and watch how so they are sort of emerged from their little sack that they had. We've discussed at length about the importance of the text selection and the creation of text sets to help build knowledge in the classroom. When creating these sets, it's important to include a range of genres, repeated and related words, and the ideas that build knowledge. We can also draw their attention to the advanced language structures in these texts, which are typically more complex, as we said, than the ones that they're reading on their own. Another way is to, and one of the best ways is to support knowledge, is to engage your students in those read-alouds by including discussions both before, during, and after the reading. By engaging in these concrete and abstract questions, you encourage that active participation by giving the children the opportunity to discuss their ideas out loud. Last session, we also talked about the importance of explicit vocabulary, and we need to make sure that we're not only defining these words, but we're also teaching about the relationships between and among them. The book gives the example about how you might teach words in categories. So for instance, when you're talking about the parts of the plant, you might give all of the parts of the plant and show how those words are interconnected, creating this larger coherent network of knowledge of all those different pieces. Again, in our Ontario context, many of these words are already listed in the curriculum documents, but you want to make sure that you're also teaching those tier 2 words that can be used across the content areas also. The last suggestion for building background knowledge in the book is about this idea of doing it during guided play. So in the first session, I showed you how my DECE and I would use 5-turn conversations when talking with our students during their free play. It was a way for us to engage with the child while they are in play. You can also do this during imaginative play. So during an imaginative play, children are often pretending to be somebody or someone else or somewhere else, which leads to more abstract or higher level thinking when answering questions as that character. So while I might ask Sally how she is doing today, when Sally is dressed up as a doctor, she's probably going to respond as that doctor. Our dramatic play centers in our classroom were always co-created by our students and supported that play. We supported that play with read-alouds and writing activities that were about the type of center that they had created, but they could also use in that center. So we had flower shops, we had a cafe. My favorite was the grocery store. And we were able to model the type of language and conversation that would happen in one of those situations, which would be different than what they engage in on a day-to-day basis. So this would be another way of having young children engage in those authentic activities. Key takeaway number 3. To read and write successfully, children need to understand and use formal language structures at the word, sentence, and passage levels. Written language, including the language of most books children encounter at school, is delivered in a formal register full of complex language structures. When we're talking to one another, we're often using a less formal language structure, but we read and write, we often use language structures that are more complex and formal. It's important that children have the opportunity to understand these structures and to use them in context. That interactive read aloud, again, offers an excellent opportunity to use those formal language structures through Strive for 5 conversations, and modeling this can help students understand how and when to use these formal structures. For modeling formal language, we can recast. So this is a downward scaffold where the teacher restructures the child's message in a way that makes it more syntactically correct, thus providing the feedback on a language structure that he or she has not yet mastered. We want to be careful here because correcting language can detract from that conversation. But when we're recasting that language, it's providing the model and the reinforcement for future conversations. You don't want to lose the kids with those unnecessary corrections or explanations. In the book, they give the following example. The student says, "I goes to the farm and saw 2 sheep." But the teacher could respond with, "Wow, you went to the farm and saw 2 sheep?" They're just recasting it by showing them what the proper way is to say it. When we are extending, we're providing an upward scaffold where the teacher adds to what the student says by adding words or phrases that make the explanation longer. We might provide a vocabulary word, or we might provide more information. We've seen this strategy in earlier sessions that when we extend, we're providing that upward scaffold because we add on to their response. These extensions should focus on the child's interest and make it more semantically complex. This can be done in that last turn by repeating their message and then adding words or phrases to make the explanation a bit longer. The example they give is when the student says, "a mouse," and the teacher says, "yes, a tiny mouse." These scaffolds can be used in both formal whole class conversations, during small group conversations, and also during that guided play. When we are extending to promote vocabulary, we absolutely can use that Strive for 5 conversation. That extending scaffold can be used in so many beautiful ways. One example that they give is, "I don't like going to the dentist." And the teacher might say, "when I have to go to the dentist, sometimes I get nervous." You might be nervous. Do you feel nervous? So you're providing that new word for the child to use as they are describing. You can also provide more information on a word that the student uses to deepen their knowledge. The teacher might say, "do you remember what happened when we went on our field trip to the zoo last month?" The student could respond with, "we took a detour." Teacher might say, "yes, the bus had to take a detour. We had to find another way of getting there." You can also have students elaborate on a word by giving an example of it. The teacher might begin with, "we've been reading about tools. Tools are something we hold in our hand that help us do something. Can you give me an example of a tool?" The student might say, "a hammer." And the teacher could say, "yes, a hammer is a tool. What does it help us do?" If the student responds, "I don't know," it's an opportunity for the teacher. A hammer helps us build things with wood and nails. In this video, the teacher models how she uses the Strive for 5 framework to model those formal language structures with her students.
What kinds of seeds have you seen? Have you seen sunflower seeds or kidney beans? You've seen sunflower seeds? That is awesome. So did everybody hear that? Cassidy just told us that the stem is part of the plant and she has seen sunflower seeds. Alyssa, where's Alyssa?
Right here.
Hi, Alyssa. What are parts of the plant?
First, I have to put the seeds and then put some water.
Yes, amazing. Did everybody hear that? First, Alyssa just told us that the seeds are part of the plant, and then once you put water, what happens?
It goes to a flower.
It grows into a flower. So what comes first? Is it the root or is it the flower?
A root and then the flower.
Good job. So the root and then the flower. Amazing job, everybody.
So you can see in this one, she's rephrasing or recasting the child's language to model that correct syntax or sentence structure. And she's extending the child's message by adding descriptive words and more complex ideas. When we look here at the actual flow of the conversation, you'll see too that she's able to go beyond those 5 turns that we were used to seeing, right? And in the end, she recasts the sentence for the whole class. And she repeats what the child has said to reinforce those language structures. One thing I liked seeing her do was how she repeats it for the whole class to appear. I don't know if you have this in your classrooms, but even though they are very, very loud during their playtime or free exploration, when it comes time to answering questions, they talk so quietly and they sort of cocoon into themselves. Recasting it so that everyone can be part of it is just equalizing for the class, that they're able to still share their ideas with everybody. So let's look at the Strive for 5 in action. The images that you were about to see came from my classroom, my kindergarten classroom last year. It started with a box. It was a big, gigantic box that a neighbor had posted on Facebook. I had no idea what I was going to do with it, but I immediately claimed it, ran out the door, went over and got it, had to take out both of the car seats, fold down the sides. It was a gigantic box. I had no idea what we were going to do with it, but I just knew that it had it had to be mine. We had already been starting to learn about what happens to animals in winter. And that was from a student-led inquiry, again, I mentioned about from our Wonder Wall. So our Wonder Wall was a place where we collected these ideas that they were thinking or wondering about. I'd collected these books from my local library as well as my school library. And while I had an idea of what I wanted them to do with the box, I really did want it to come from the kids themselves. We had been talking about how some animals migrated for the winter while others adapted, changing parts about themselves or the surroundings to help them survive through the winter. It didn't take them long to make that connection that the box could be used as a den or a shelter for a sociodramatic play space. We started a conversation about what we knew about dens and what we should include in our den. We had actually just watched a video from the National Park Service where they were showing how they tag bears in the wintertime while they're hibernating and measure the bear cubs. And they were really into that video. So they had just learned and seen a variety of different dens from bears across America. We started exploring the concept of this being a den and thinking about what we would want to add to our den to make it more realistic. These ideas were captured in both whole and small group, and then we went around the room collecting things that could be added to our den. We settled on some pretend leaves and then some extra animals. And as the holidays had just occurred, we also brought in some natural elements to our outdoor play, and the kids were able to practice some hibernating behaviors outside too. They would take boughs of evergreen and tuck them into the corners or lay them on the snow to shield themselves from the cold. They got into it, is what I'm trying to say. We also extended this activity to our loose parts and our crafting stations, where they were able to take what they knew about hibernation in dens and create mini habitats for their little bears. We also extended their learning through writing, where they could write concretely using labels. So they would draw a picture of their den and then label the different parts, the different animals, using very concrete words and word walls. But they were also able to write more inferentially about what the animals might need in the winter or how they might be feeling or what it might feel like to take a rest for a long time. When we're thinking about where the Strive for 5 framework lives in this kindergarten example, at the whole time that we're stopping and we're thinking about asking about what we need, that's where that framework would come in. So if a child would say, I think we need extra leaves. Why do we think we need the extra leaves? I was able to bring that conversation framework and really push their thinking about what we needed and what we should include. We had those more concrete examples of the objects that we needed, but then they were also beginning to rationalize why those different things were there. As we were reading more texts about hibernation, and they were also living that experience of hibernating in the classroom, they were able to use the vocabulary they were learning in their books in their sociodramatic play. So it would be like not uncommon in my classroom at that time to just hear somebody say, please leave me alone, I'm hibernating, or I need more stuff for my den, it's not very comfortable, right? I need to make it more inviting. These were some of the words that we were using while we were discussing that. Before we move into the breakout room task, are there any questions or things that you would like to discuss about this idea of moving from concrete to abstract thinking through these conversations? Feel free to unmute or type them in the chat. So here's what we're going to do tonight. Before we do that, I'll just leave these here. We've read them a few times now, but these are our breakout room norms created by Jordan on our team. And here is our task tonight. You are going to read over the excerpt from this Nelson literacy text. I chose this because these are readily available in most schools. They are a little bit of an older resource, so you do want to check that the science and social studies are still relevant for what we're teaching, but they are really vibrant texts. They have been really well thought out, and if you don't necessarily need to follow the prompts in the Nelson literacy to use these texts. So we've got them here for you tonight. You're going to use the question continuum to develop at least one type of question for each level of the continuum. So I believe MJ has just put that in the chat there. That is a link to the document. I'm going to show you really quickly. quickly what that, ooh, no, wrong way. So you can see here, you'll have access to the 2 pages, the 2-page spread. And then in your group, here is that continuum. And you can just type an example of each of those, one question for each of those examples in the chat there. So we've got 30 some odd. We'll probably do about 4 people per group, maybe somewhere along there. I don't know the math on that one. Can't do math that quickly. And then we'll come back in about 10 minutes. So once those breakout rooms are open, feel free to join. Okay, welcome back. I can see what you guys do from my end, and these questions are amazing. So I highly, highly encourage you after to go through and look what everybody wrote. Very few of you wrote the same questions, which I think is just so great that even though you were working within a framework, you were able to write different types of questions based on a very simple piece of text, right? There's not much in that text, but the creativity and the thoughtfulness that you guys used in those questions were so, like, just so wonderful. Just lovely. So thanks so much for that. I just want to walk us through that activity. So let's think about this, and please feel free to write in the chat if you do have an answer. What did you do in this activity? If you could write in the chat, what were you doing in this activity? Feel free to just type that in there. Helping students clarify the thinking, creating a continuum of questions. Very good. Can you describe to me how the activity went? How did the activity go? Some were easy, some were harder. Next question. Why do you think this activity was structured in this way? To build complexity, to help students delve deeper. And then lastly, how has this exercise influenced the way you think or learn? Being intentional. Very good. So thank you to those who wrote those in the chat. In case it wasn't glaringly obvious, what I just walked you through was using this question continuum, right? We went from this concrete, what did you do, to this more level 4 explaining how has it influenced the way you're thinking. So this idea of walking kids through different levels of thinking can be achieved through questioning and through that conversation, right? You can do this in conversation. We can scaffold up and we can scaffold down as need be. So it's that intentionality of the types of questions that we ask that helps kids move their thinking to that higher order thinking skills. We can support this process, again, with that framework. And while we're scaffolding up or down as needed, we're still modeling that formal language structure. This is all that we have for tonight. But before we get to the winner, are there any questions? Please feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat if you have any last questions about this questioning continuum or how we might move children's abstract thinking.
I have a question. It's not about the continuum, but with text sets.
Yeah.
Are they created around a topic or a theme?
Topic. So when we're thinking about a theme like friendship,
okay, thank you.
It's hard to build that background knowledge, but the topic of, say, like right now I'm doing roles and responsibilities, like how can we be a good citizen? I mean, some people would argue that that is also a theme, but this idea of creating a topic that's going to build knowledge. So for us in grade 1, our topic that we are looking at right now is we're looking at the child's life. And so we're looking at important events in their lives. And so I've brought together a bunch of different books that show important events. For instance, we're learning about bar mitzvahs. We're learning about, we read the Proudest Blue last week about wearing the hijab for the first time, all of these milestones, like that the topic is about learning about their lives. We want to connect it to those content areas. When we get a little too vague, we might just not be clarifying enough for them and building the knowledge that we are thinking that we're building. So it's really about thinking about what is the intentionality of what we're wanting them to learn. I'm trying to think of which one it was. I can get back to you on this one, but I know that ONlit has done something specific on this. I'm thinking it's Kate Wynn, but it may have been at the IDA conference last year. But I remember her talking about the differences between those two. I will go through my little file of facts of memory and get back to you on that one. But I'm pretty sure it was Kate Wynn and Lee Fettis and Nellie Caruso who presented on the difference between topics and themes in their book. So let me think on that one, and I'll let you know for next week. Are there any? Oh, I see some things happening in the chat here. Is there a resource that would expand on the? Oh, no problem. On the types of questions in each area. So you could definitely look, like if you go to page 90, I want to say it was in the text, and look at their references that they are sourcing about the different levels. So they are sourcing blank et al. 1978 as well as 2003. And so in the back, obviously, it will have the actual source. That's a great book on asking questions. I'm just looking at my wall of books here. This book on comprehension has a lot on questioning as well. The Know Better, Do Better, and they talk more about the different levels of comprehension, and they can get at that through questioning as well. Is it good to look at blank's level of questioning, which this may be based on? So is that what I just said, Fiona? I think that's the word that I just used, right? Yeah, it's got to be the same one. I can't imagine, Fiona, that there's more than one person named blank. So that is who she is referencing in the story on that one. Thanks. So it could be the exact same one. You'd have to look in the text to see what they are doing. I'm just clicking on your link there so that you can see that she's got this here. I'm sure it's simple. So this is a great share, Fiona. Thank you. So it's very likely the same author there. Thank you for that. So that's in the chat there if you want on that. Okay, so without further ado, I'm happy to stay on, but I do want to honor your time. Our winner tonight, we want the feedback. Thank you for this slide. So we are in that point of our cycle with ONlit where we are preparing reports for the ministry. So if you could take a moment to fill out that feedback form about ONlit and this book study, but also ONlit in general, that would be really helpful for us. It helps us to keep going with what we're doing with supporting the different initiatives that we have. So please fill that out. We also have for you a winner. Are we ready? Here we go. Our final meeting will be Wednesday, November 27th at 7 p.m. Please read chapters 9 and 10 and consider sharing your experience in selecting a text for an interactive read aloud or Strive for 5 conversation, just like we've done every week. Again, if you need to reach out to me at any point in the next 2 weeks, Melissa@onlit.org will get you into my inbox. I love hearing from you. We had some great ideas about creating a Google form for you to be adding your suggestions to, so we will get on that. But thank you so much. Those of you who are teachers, I know that this week you are probably doing parent-teacher interviews, so I very much appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules this week with report cards and the time change and all of that stuff. I mean, I know the time change was 2 weeks ago, but I'm still affected by it. So thank you so much, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Have a good evening.